my 15-minute spiritual kickstart to the week. I hope it offers some spiritual nourishment for the week ahead. I'm joined this morning by Nigel Savage, the CEO of HaZon, the largest Jewish environmental group. Nigel and I met, I think it was 2 years ago, on the bike ride, the Hazon bike ride, where we rode from Jerusalem to Eilat in Israel. It was a glorious week of riding my bike through the desert and through Israel. I just love that week. I made some great friends there. So Nigel, I'm so excited to have you on the show, as I like to call it, which is a little dramatic, I think. And I should also add that Nigel is joining us from Camp Isabella Friedman, the Jewish Retreat Center. And he's a little bundled up. It's a little colder there. And we're grateful you're up there celebrating Rosh Hashanah, I believe. And so, Nigel, why don't you start and tell us a little bit of how and why you started HaZon and what the inspiration for that was.
Thank you. So, Rabbi Moskowitz, Steve, first of all, I'm just honored to be here this morning, and I just want to say Shana Tova, and it's kind of amazing to join you after this strange Rosh Hashanah across the Jewish world where almost everything was different. And I want to tell you a bit about HaZon and me, but just in 2 sentences, how was Rosh Hashanah for you?
Well, it was very meaningful, and I think people found the services beautiful. I would say we still did Avinu Malkeinu, and we may not have had the sanctuary filled with people, but we still, I think, filled our hearts with the words of our tradition. And so I do believe that helped, and it helped, and hopefully will lead us to a year of health and spiritual nourishment. So tell us about HaZon, but thank you for the question.
So yeah, and I will also just say equivalently, I'm here at Isabella Friedman, and we did a Rosh Hashanah retreat, and we did it in COVID-friendly terms. We had about 50 adults. We were basically davening outdoors. And it was really, really remarkable. And for so many people, it was the first time to have even vaguely a sense of physical normality, even as it was abnormal. And just a reminder of how powerful Jewish community is, and both that we can do certain things online and in other ways, but that also to be able to celebrate Rosh Hashanah outdoors and in the Berkshires in a beautiful place, very profound. I'll say as a segue to me, I grew up in North Manchester in England, which is not an outdoorsy place. I'm from the chubby, intellectual, nerdy wing of the Manchester Jewish community. And I found myself in Jerusalem in my early 30s, learning at Pardes, liberal co-ed yeshiva in Jerusalem. And a friend, Mark Barnett, invited me on a C2C hike from Achziv on the Mediterranean coast to the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And I said, okay, without really thinking about it. And 6 weeks later, I was the oldest of 5 guys in the center of Jerusalem, wearing a heavy backpack, pouring with rain, and thinking, holy moly, what was I thinking? And I was really scared to do this hike. And in fact, it was amazing. And I really loved it. And I saw that it was good to push oneself physically outdoors. I saw that it was an amazing way to bring people together across difference. And I saw that Jewish tradition didn't enter human history in a synagogue, a temple, a JCC, that we entered human history in relationship to the natural world, indeed in relationship to the land of Israel. And that the Torah is a record of us entering history as an indigenous people, land, language, life cycle, climate. And that was ultimately what led me to founding HaZon. We started HaZon in 2000 with a cross-USA Jewish environmental bike ride. And I led a rather motley group in cycling from Seattle, Washington to Washington, DC.
Wow.
To environmental awareness. And we stopped in synagogues and churches. We did press and TV. We got an award from the EPA. And that was how HaZon began.
And when was that?
That was 2000. That was 20 years ago this year.
Wow. Mazel tov on the anniversary.
Yeah. And we've grown and evolved since then. And at this point, HaZon fundamentally is trying to turn the Jewish community outwards to take on the climate crisis and environmental sustainability and use that process to strengthen Jewish life.
Can you tell? I mean, I found it very profound the idea that the Torah started in the Midbar, in the wilderness, in nature.
Yeah.
Can you? I mean, we're because we don't speak about that in the Jewish tradition. I mean, we don't emphasize that.
Yeah, and it's just so amazing if you think about this last weekend and the range of Jewish experiences, but from the most liberal Reform community to the most extreme ultra-Orthodox community, it's the same Torah, it's the same readings, and we've done it for 2,500 years. And on the first day of our Israel ride, we often cycle from Jerusalem to Ashkelon, and we have a Mori Derech, a tour guide called Bill Slot. And one year, Bill's Slot, it's not a long ride, it's about 35 or 40 miles. Bill's but a series of different ecosystems. Jerusalem's in the hills, and then it's green, and then the Mediterranean. There are 7 species, the Shivat Haminim, that are mentioned in Dvarim in the book of Deuteronomy, that are indigenous to the land of Israel. And we passed all 7 of them in one short day's bike ride. That's what it means that we entered human history as an indigenous people. And the trace elements of that are there in every single pasha. That's literally how we entered human history.
Yeah, I remember that day being a longer ride.
That may be true. That may be true. It may well have been 55 or 60. You're quite right.
But it is remarkable that you have such, the different climates and the different environments all within this small area of the land of Israel. You could be, there were some tough climbs on that day, I remember, and then you're on the sea in a matter of hours, and the humidity and the heat there.
But I think there are even deeper lessons of this. So for example, and again, just thinking about the way that we relate to the world today. The Jewish people in the land of Egypt are in a place that has infinite water from the Nile. And that's what leads to Pharaoh and slavery, literally. Then they go into the wilderness where there is water, tiny bits of water, but not enough in any way to sustain any kind of really organized life. And then they enter the land of Israel. And the land of Israel has more water than the desert, but a lot less than Egypt. And we're never sure of it. Well, that cycle imprints itself on Jewish tradition. It's why at the end of Sukkot, we say a prayer for rain. It's why we add Moed HaGashem, like who makes the rain fall and the wind to blow, in the Amidah all the way through until Pesach. And it's why at Pesach we stop. It's why the second paragraph of the Shema connects our behaviors with the heavens closing. Well, for most of modernity, we were like, we don't believe in this stuff. We don't believe literally that if I do or don't keep the mitzvot, God will close the heavens, right? And many of our sidurs dropped out the second paragraph of the Shema. But suddenly what we are feeling in this generation is a greater sense of provisionality, a greater sense of uncertainty, right? The whole era of COVID is about uncertainty. We literally don't know what's happening. But think about all of the shuls in Oregon and California. I spoke to a rabbi who 3 times they had to move what they were planning to do because of the fires, even after they'd made COVID plans. And so part of what it also means to be heir to the tradition of the Torah and the Talmud as an indigenous people is, what does it mean to understand that sense of provisionality that the Jewish people entered human history with, and that sense of both gratitude, yirah, which means both awe but also fear, and a sense that the world depends on our behaviors.
Do you see Hazon's mission? I mean, I don't mean to simplify this, but that the idea is that this is part of our tradition and we're forgetting this fundamental and important part. I mean, that the connection to nature is embedded in our tradition from the very start to, the prayers that we say, and we're not talking about it enough, and we're not thinking about that because here we live where I have plenty of water. Is that part of part of your message and part of what you're trying to teach?
What's interesting is that I think I started off Hazon with a very strong impulse towards that. And funnily enough, what's happened in the world in the last few years has actually helped me to clarify that although I actually think that that's rich and interesting and we should access it, it's actually less important than literally just turning the Jewish community outwards to take these issues on seriously today, whether we care about those references or not. So a year from now, Rosh Hashanah starts the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year in Jewish life. Itself fascinating about relationship to land, inequality, food, debt, all kinds of issues that are salient in our lives today. But 2 years from now starts a new 7-year cycle in Jewish life that runs from 2022 to 2029. What increasingly we are saying to Jewish institutions, and we would say to your community, is we need to be spending the next 2 years to brainstorm the 7 years after that, because we're going to have to take it slowly. We can't suddenly swivel on a dime, and we've got enough on our plate at the moment with COVID. But what does it mean if by 2029, every Jewish institution, if you walk into it, is absolutely clearly taking the environmental crisis seriously? That would change the power that we use, the food that we serve, how we serve it. Do we have bicycle racks and showers? How do we involve our bar and bat mitzvah kids? What about the interfaith piece? What about the advocacy piece? How do we integrate this into the education that we do? And I think of it increasingly as being parallel to the feminist movement, the Jewish women's movement over the last 50 or 70 years. And there were all sorts of women who said, why can't a girl have a bat mitzvah? Why can't a woman be a rabbi? Why should women be paid any less than men? And there were a whole series of people, organizations within Jewish life, within the wider world. But within 50 years, our institutions have changed. And to walk into a Jewish institution today as a 6-year-old girl, 16-year-old, a 56-year-old, right? It's different than it was then. And we have to make an equivalent series of changes around environmental sustainability. And we don't have 50 years to do it in.
Do you have some specifics that you would say, like, oh, if we accomplish these, we're going to be really on our way? I mean, or just that, part of your sort of wish list?
Well, I would say two things, one general and one specific. I actually think that the general one is for the institution simply to make the commitment. We have a HaZons seal of sustainability, and it simply begins with the board, the CEO, the chair, and the senior rabbi formally signing up and saying, yes, we commit to a multi-year process of trying to do better, which after all is what the whole liturgy, right, of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is about. Simply, we want to try and do better. I think that commitment's terribly important. Then within that, each institution needs to go on its own learning journey and try and figure out what makes sense for us. We need to learn about environmental impact. But the specific example I would give you is about food. Food is so central to Jewish life.
Yes.
And yet it turns out, for example, that meat, industrial meat and dairy, is one of the 2 or 3 largest drivers of anthropogenic climate change. What would it mean for a community to spend a year asking the question, what does it mean to eat Jewishly as an institution? Do we grow any of our food? Do we compost our food? Do we serve soda? Why or why not? Do we use plastic bottles? Why or why not? Do we serve industrial meat or dairy? Why or why not? How do we involve our kids in this? How do we involve our neighbors about this? What about the Farm Bill and food justice? Have we invited in our local elected officials to say, you know that we keep kosher, but the Jewish understanding of food is about more than that. So can you talk to us about food policy in Long Island or in the state of New York or in this country? And I think that properly done, those conversations are really profound. It's a chance for a community to go on a learning journey. It involves the rabbi and the clergy. It involves members of the board. It'll involve some of the teenagers. We've just started a Jewish youth climate movement this year, and we've got a growing number of teens all over the country just fired up and doing stuff. And on the other side of it, each community will take different decisions, but you'll have learned about food. You'll have learned about Jewish tradition. You'll have learned about human impact. You'll have strengthened your relationships with each other. You'll almost certainly have built relationships with other people and other institutions. And somebody walking into that temple, that synagogue, a year and a half later, will, in all sorts of subtle and profound ways, experience the institution as being different.
You seem to have a keen sense that institutions move slowly. So that you seem to be quite patient, I would say, about this process. But yet, there is a great deal of impatience that's required in terms of the climate crisis. I mean, this summer in some ways has been a reckoning on a number of fronts, I would say. these were always problems that were there, but I think people are more and more coming to terms with it. That's how I see sort of part of what's happening, this summer. I mean, just COVID, for example, my health depends on the person who I bump into, whether if they have health care or not. I mean, that affects me. And there's a sense that we are much more interconnected than we believed, or perhaps than we recognized and admitted. So don't you need a certain amount of impatience to get this done?
So I feel incredibly impatient, and I think we do.
You seem very calm, though.
I think the reality is that this is chronic rather than acute, right? We're really going to have to deal with this year, this next decade, this next 20 years. I think this starts this year on January 26th. January the 20th is the inauguration of the new president. I think that it's going to be a very complicated and intense and stressful period for this country between now and then. And Tu B'Shvat is January 26th. It's 6 days later than the inauguration. And we're starting to say to Jewish institutions, make that Tu B'Shvat an important Tu B'Shvat. It's not just fruit and nuts. It's not just for kids. Plan to do something as a community. Invite neighboring shuls or communities. Invite a couple of elected officials and say, this is the start of the year. It's 8 months till the Shemitah year in Jewish life. It's the start of a new 4-year life in American political life. This new year for trees, after that 2020 that we just went through, is the year that we have to change our game. And Tu B'Shvat, the new year for trees, is a great moment to begin. And we want to invite institutions to do events on Tu B'Shvat under the title, The Urgency of Now. And that's the moment for
we've got to shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I of course, as a rabbi, love the connection to a Jewish holiday, and I appreciate you providing me with sermon material and teaching material so far in advance of a Jewish holiday, and I especially appreciate, we tend, I don't know how to say this, but we tend to belittle our holidays. We just talk about the nuts and the fruit. We don't see the global message. I mean, I think that's part of what you're driving at. Let's eat a little fruit. Let's make a creative recipe for charoset for Passover. And there's this huge, message about all that's embedded in all of these holidays. Sometimes, and I think this is part of where you started us, looking at the Torah from sort of, just as with a wider lens, as opposed to the Torah portion of the week, gives one that whole sort of gigantic message about how we're supposed to be connected to the earth, and we've lost that. I do feel sometimes we need some of the impatience of the prophets I grant you that they weren't listened to very much in their own generation. So that's a little bit of worry about how they delivered their message.
No, I think, so the next stop is Yom Kippur. And I just think that it's so fascinating that on the day of Yom Kippur, we read Sefer Yonah, right? We read the book of Jonah. And it's precisely this prophecy in which he says, if you don't change your behavior, right, Nineveh is going to be destroyed. And they repent.
And Nineveh changes, yeah.
And there's no more profound message for our era that we are starting to see what will happen if we don't change our ways. Right. And at the same time, we have to change.
Yeah. So I'm going to leave, I want to conclude with this thought, because we're sort of winding down. I've often taught that, people say, you'll often hear people be skeptical about the ability of human beings to change. But Judaism fundamentally believes that we can. Otherwise, all that we're doing for these 10 days doesn't make sense. I mean, it fundamentally believes that we can actually turn. That tshuva, it makes for a strong person. That you can admit error, we can admit error, and we can do something differently in the coming year. Otherwise, the whole point of the high holidays, it does not make any sense. So I want to thank you for joining me on this day and reminding us of our connection to nature and sort of the enormous task ahead of us, but that we can do something. So I appreciate that message of hope. So thank you for joining me, Nigel. I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful to learn from you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Boker Tov.